Hi guys, let's start part 2 of chapter 5, that is Pastoralist in the Modern World. 2.1. How did these changes affect the life of pastoralist? These measures led to a serious shortage of pastures. When grazing lands were taken over and turned into cultivated fields, the available areas of pasture land declined. Similarly, the reservations of forest meant that shepherds and cattle herders could no longer freely pasture their cattle in the forest. As pasture lands disappeared under the plough, the existing animal stock had to feed on whatever grazing land remained. These led to continuous, intensive grazing of these pastures. Usually, nomadic pastoralists grazed their animals in one area and moved to another area. These pastoral movements allowed time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. When restrictions were imposed on pastoral movement, grazing lands came to be continuously used and the quality of pastures declined. This in turn created a further shortage of forage for animals and the deterioration of animal stock. Underfed cattle died in large numbers during scarcities and famines. We have a map here. So, figure 11, pastoralist in India. This map indicates the location of only those pastoral communities mentioned in the chapter. There are many others living in various parts of India. So these are the names of different pastoralists according to the reason. So reason wise pastoralist names. 2.2. How did the pastoralists cope with these changes? Pastoralists reacted to these changes in a variety of ways. Some reduced the number of cattle. So, what is the changes or what is the reaction of the pastoralist? Some reduced the number of cattle in their herds, since there was not enough pasture to feed large numbers. Others discovered new pastures when movement to old grazing grounds became difficult. After 1947, the camel and sheep herding, Raikas for instance, could no longer move into Sindh and graze their camels on the banks of the Indus as they had done earlier. The new political boundaries between India and Pakistan stopped their movement, so they had to find new places to go. In recent years, they have been migrating to Haryana, where sheep can graze on agricultural fields after the harvest are cut. This is the time that the fields need manure and the animals provide. Over the years, some richer pastoralists began buying land. So some of them they bought land and settled down, giving up their nomadic life. Some became settled peasants, cultivating land. Others took to more extensive trading. Many poor pastoralists, on the other hand, borrowed money from moneylenders to survive. At times, they lost their cattle and sheep and became laborers working on fields or in small towns. Yet, pastoralists not only continue to survive in many regions, their numbers have expanded over recent decades. When pasture lands in one place was closed to them, they changed the direction of their movement, reduced the size of the herd. So, what did they do? They changed the direction of their movement. And number two, they reduced the size of the herd. Number three, combined pastoral activity with other forms of income. And number four, adapted to the changes in the modern world. This is very important. They have to adapt to the changes. Many ecologists believe that in dry regions and in the mountains, pastoralism is still ecologically the most viable form of life. Such changes were not experienced only by pastoral communities in India. In many other parts of the world, new laws and settlement patterns forced pastoral communities to alter their lives. How did pastoral communities elsewhere cope with these changes in the modern world? So let's find out about the other pastoralists in other parts of the world. Now we have pastoralism in Africa. Let us move to Africa, where over half the world's pastoral population lives. Even today, over 22 million Africans depend on some form of pastoral activity for their livelihood. They include communities like Bedouins, Berbers, Maasai, Somali, Boran, and Turkana. Most of them now live in the semi-arid grasslands or arid deserts where rain-fed agriculture is difficult. They raise cattle, camels, goats, sheep, and donkeys, and they sell milk, meat, animal skin, and wool. Some also earn through trade and transport, other combined pastoral activity with agriculture. Still others do a variety of odd jobs to supplement their meager and uncertain earnings from pastoralism. Like pastoralists in India, the lives of African pastoralists have changed dramatically over the colonial and post colonial periods. What have these changes been? So let's find out the changes. We have a figure here, figure 12, a view of Maasai Land with Kilimanjaro in the background. So this is the Maasai Land. Forced by changing conditions, the Maasai have grown dependent on food produced in other areas such as maize meal, then rice, potatoes, cabbage. Traditionally, the Maasai frowned upon these. Maasai believed that tilling the land for crop farming is a crime against nature. Once you cultivate the land, it is no longer suitable for grazing. Here's a map. Figure 13, Pastoral Communities in Africa. The inset shows the location of the Maasais in Kenya and Tanzania. We will discuss some of these changes by looking at one pastoral community, the Maasai, in some detail. So, let's see what happens or what changes have taken place in the Maasai community. The Maasai cattle herders live primarily in East Africa. So where do they live? They live in East Africa. 300,000 in southern Kenya and another 150,000 in Tanzania. So they live in southern Kenya and Tanzania. We will see how new laws and regulations took away their land and restricted their movement. This affected their lives in times of drought and even reshaped their social relationships. 3.1 Where have the grazing lands gone? One of the problems the Maasais have faced is the continuous loss of their grazing lands. So they lost their grazing lands. Before colonial times, Maasai Land stretched over a vast area from North Kenya to the steppes of northern Tanzania. In the last 19th century, European imperial powers scrambled for territorial possessions in Africa, slicing up the region into different colonies. In 1885, Maasai Land was cut into half with an international boundary between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. Subsequently, the best grazing lands were gradually taken over for white settlements, and the Maasai were pushed into small area in South Kenya and North Tanzania. The Maasai lost about 40% of their pre-colonial lands. They were confined on an arid zone with uncertain rainfall and poor pastures. On Tanganyika, Britain conquered what had been German East Africa. So Britain conquered what had been German East Africa during the First World War. In 1919, Tanganyika came under British control. It attained independence in 1961 and united with Zanzibar to form Tanzania in 1964. From the late 19th century, the British colonial government in East Africa also encouraged local peasant communities to expand cultivation. As cultivation expanded, pastoral lands. As cultivation expanded, pastoral lands were turned into cultivated fields. In pre-colonial times, the Maasai Pastoralists had dominated their agricultural neighbors, both economically and politically. By the end of colonial rule, the situation had reversed. Large areas of grazing land were also turned into game reserves, like Masai Mara and Samburu National Park in Kenya and Serengeti Park in Tanzania. Pastoralists were not allowed to enter these reserves. They could neither hunt animals nor graze their herds in these areas. Very often, these reserves were in areas that had traditionally been regular grazing grounds for Maasai herds. The Serengeti National Park, for instance, was created over 14,760 kilometers of Maasai grazing land. So it drastically impacted the Maasai pastoralist. So here's a figure. Figure 14. Without grass, livestock like cattle, goats, and sheep are malnourished, which means less food available for families and their children. The areas hardest hit by drought and food shortage are in the vicinity of Amboseli National Park, which last year generated approximately 240 million Kenyan shillings, estimated 3.5 million US dollar from tourism. In addition, the Kilimanjaro water project cuts through the communities of this area, but the villagers are barred from using the water for irrigation or for livestock. Here's another figure, figure 15. The title Maasai derives from the word Ma. Maasai means my people. The Maasai are traditionally nomadic and pastoral people who depend on milk and meat for subsistence. High temperatures combine with low rainfall to create conditions which are dry, dusty, and extremely hot. Drought conditions are common in this semi-arid land of equatorial heats. During such times, pastoral animals die in large numbers. We have a source, E. Pastoral communities elsewhere in Africa faced similar problems. In Namibia, in southwest Africa, the Kaukoland herders traditionally moved between Kaukoland and nearby Ovamboland, and they sold skin, meat, and other trade products in neighboring markets. All this was stopped with the new system of territorial boundaries that restricted movements between regions. The nomadic cattle herders of Kaukoland in Namibia complained. We have difficulty. We cry. We are imprisoned. We do not know why we are locked up. We are in jail. We have no place to live. We cannot get meat from the south. Our slipping skins cannot be sent out. Ovamboland is closed for us. We lived in Ovamboland for a long time. We want to take our cattle there, also our sheep and goats. The borders are closed. The borders press us heavily. We cannot live. Statement of Baukoland Herders, Namibia, 1949. We have another source, F. In most places in colonial Africa, the police were given instructions to keep a watch on the movements of pastoralists and prevent them from entering white areas. The following is one such instructions given by a magistrate to the police in southwest Africa, restricting the movements of the pastoralists of Kaukoland in Namibia. Passes to enter the territory should not be given to these natives unless exceptional circumstances necessitate their entering. The object of the above proclamation is to restrict the number of natives entering the territory and to keep a check on them, and ordinary visiting passes should therefore never be issued to them. Kauko-Veld permits to enter. Magistrate to Police Station Commander of Aujo and Kamanjab, 24th November 1937. The loss of the finest grazing lands and water resources created pressure on the small area of land that the Maasai were confined within. Continuous grazing within a small area inevitably meant a deterioration of the quality of pastures. So the quality of pastures declined. Fodder was always in short supply. Feeding the cattle became a persistent problem. 3.2 The borders are closed. In the 19th century, African pastoralists could move over vast areas in search of pastures. When the pastures were exhausted in one place, they moved to a different area to graze their cattle. From the late 19th century, the colonial government began imposing various restrictions on their mobility. Like the Maasai, other pastoral groups were also forced to live within the confines of special reserves. The boundaries of these reserves became the limits within which they could now move. They were not allowed to move out with their stock without special permits. They were not allowed to move out with their stock without special permits, and it was difficult to get permits without trouble and harassment. Those found guilty of disobeying the rules were severely punished. Pastoralists were also not allowed to enter the markets in white areas. In many regions, they were prohibited from participating in any form of trade. So they were prohibited from participating in any form of trade. White settlers and European colonists saw pastoralists as dangerous and savage people with whom all contact had to be minimized. Cutting off all links was, however, never really possible because white colonists had to depend on black labor. So they depended on black labor to bore mines and build roads and towns. The new territorial boundaries and restrictions imposed on them suddenly changed the lives of pastoralists. This adversely affected both their pastoral and trading activities. Earlier, pastoralists not only looked after animal herds but traded in various products. The restrictions under colonial rule did not entirely stop their trading activities, but they were now subject to various restrictions. 3.3 When pastures dry. Droughts affects the life of pastoralists everywhere. When rains fail and pastures are dry, cattle are likely to starve unless they can be moved to areas where forage is available. That is why traditionally pastoralists are nomadic. They move from place to place. This nomadism allows them to survive bad times and avoid crisis. But from the colonial period, the Maasai were bound down to a fixed area, confined within a reserve and prohibited from moving in search of pastures. They were cut off from the best grazing lands and forced to live within a semi-arid tract prone to frequent droughts. Since they could not shift their cattle to places where pastures were available, large numbers of Maasai cattle died of starvation and disease in these years of drought. An inquiry in 1930 showed that the Maasai in Kenya possessed 720,000 cattle, 820,000 sheep, and 171,000 donkeys. In just 2 years of severe drought, 1933 and 1934, over half the cattle in the Maasai Reserve died. As the area of grazing lands shrank, the adverse effect of the droughts increased in intensity. The frequent bad years led to a steady decline of the animal stock of the pastoralist. 3.4 Not all were equally affected. In Maasai Land, as elsewhere in Africa, not all pastoralists were equally affected by the changes in the colonial period. In pre-colonial times, Maasai society was divided into two social categories. So they were divided into two social categories. The first one, elders, and the second one, warriors. The elders formed the ruling group and met in periodic councils to decide on the affairs of the community and settle disputes. The warriors consisted of younger people, mainly responsible for the protection of the tribe. They defended the community and organized cattle raids. Raiding was important in a society where cattle was wealth. It is through raids that the power of different pastoral groups was asserted. Young men came to be recognized as members of the warrior clan when they proved their manliness by raiding the cattle of other pastoral groups and participating in wars. They, however, were subject to the authority of the elders. We have a figure here, figure 16. Note how the warriors wear traditional deep red shukas, brightly beaded Maasai jewelry, and carry 5-foot steel-tipped spears. Their long pleats of intricate plaited hair are tinted red with ochre. As per tradition, they face east to honor the rising sun. Warriors are in charge of society's security, while boys are responsible for herding livestock. During the drought season, both warriors and boys assume responsibility for herding livestock. Another figure. Figure 17. Even today, young men go through an elaborate ritual before they become warriors, although actually it is no longer common. They must travel throughout the section's region for about 4 months, ending with an event where they run to the homestead and enter with an attitude of a raider. During the ceremony, boys dress in loose clothing and dance non-stop throughout the day. This ceremony is the transition into a new age. Girls are not required to go through such a ritual. To administer the affairs of the Maasai, the British introduced a series of measures that had important implications. They appointed chiefs. So, what did they do is that they appointed chiefs of different subgroups of Maasai who were made responsible for the affairs of the tribe. The British imposed various restrictions on raiding and warfare. Consequently, the traditional authority of both elders and soldiers was adversely affected. The chiefs appointed by the colonial government often accumulated wealth over time. They had a regular income with which they could buy animals, goods, and land. They lent money to the poor neighbors who needed cash to pay taxes. Many of them began living in towns and became involved in trade. Their wives and children stayed back in the villages to look after the animals. These chiefs managed to survive the devastations of war and drought. They had both pastoral and non-pastoral income and could buy animals when their stock was depleted. But the life history of the poor pastoralists who depended only on their livestock was different. Most often, they did not have the resources to tide over bad times. In times of war and famine, they lost nearly everything. They had to go looking for work in the towns. Some eked out a living as charcoal burners. Others did odd jobs. The lucky could get more regular work in the road or building construction. The social changes in Maasai society occurred at 2 levels. First, the traditional difference based on age between the elders and warriors was disturbed, though it did not break down entirely. And the second is that a new distinction between the wealthy and poor pastoralists developed. So this is the social changes in the Maasai society. We have conclusion now. So we see that Pastoral communities in different parts of the world are affected in a variety of different ways by changes in the modern world. New laws and new borders affect the patterns of their movement. With increasing restrictions on their mobility, pastoralists find it difficult to move in search of pastures. As pasture lands disappear, grazing becomes a problem, while pastures that remain deteriorate through continuous overgrazing. So, as pasture lands disappear, grazing becomes a problem, while pastures that remain deteriorate through continuous overgrazing. Times of drought become times of crisis when cattle die in large numbers. Yet pastoralists do adapt to new times. They change the paths of their annual movement, reduce their cattle numbers, press for rights to enter new areas, exert political pressure on the government for relief, subsidy, and other forms of support, and demand a right in the management of forest and water resources. Pastoralists are not relics of the past. They are not people who have no place in the modern world. Environmentalists and economists have increasingly come to recognize that pastoral nomadism is a form of life that is perfectly suited to many hilly and dry regions of the world. Here's a figure 18, a Rika Sippert Araika Sippert on Jaipur Highway. Heavy traffic on the highways has made migration of Sipperts a new experience. So that's all guys. See you in my next video. Bye.